My colleague and this year's topic director, Julia Vokolantsev, will say more about this year's theme of truth, but suffice it to say that our aim at this symposium is not to produce a definitive answer about the truth, but to explore new ways of asking questions and seeking answers. Before I forget, I want to note one important and recent change to our announced program. Mina Magda, who was initially scheduled to be our final presenter, will unfortunately not be able to join us due to a family emergency. But in light of this change, we have invited Dr. Anna Lolua and Dr. Spencer Small to the panel. Anna and Spencer are two of our postdocs this year and have been part of the organizing committee for the symposium. They were the ones who helped conceive of the topic of border, the final panel topic of the day. And we are excited that they will actually be joining us in a scholarly role and presenting their research. Tiffany Nguyen, one of our doctoral fellows, has graciously agreed to be the moderator, since Spencer, who was initially going to be the moderator for that panel, will now be a presenter. And a special thanks to the organizing committee, and their names are in the program, but I do want to read them out for the sake of the online and for the recording. Jennifer Sierra, Chris Halstead, Delba Kakzad, all of whom are also serving as moderators today. Doctoral fellows Priya Nambra, Tiffany Nguyen, Austin Swetchan, Eleanor Webb, and a big thanks to Caitlin Atkins, who as Graduate Research Associate has held things together this year in so many ways. Huge thank you in advance also to the staff of the Wolf Center, Associate Director Sarah Varney, and the amazingly capable staff members Erin Bailey and Pamela Horn, without whom nothing would happen at the center. But funding is also a big part of what makes things happen, so I want to express our gratitude to the Wolf Family Foundation, the Hershey Family Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the School of Arts and Sciences. And for all this particular symposium's co-sponsors, you see the names on the screen: Department of Anthropology, English, History and Sociology of Science, Philosophy, Russian and East European Studies, the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, the Center for East Asian Studies, and the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. And this gives you a bit of a sense of how broadly interdisciplinary we are and this symposium will be. A huge special thanks to the Kislak Center for the special collections, rare books, and manuscripts, who are kindly sharing their beautiful space with us today. And now I cede the microphone to my dear colleague, Dr. Yulia Vokolantsev, Associate Professor in Russian and East European Studies, and this year's topic director. Yulia.
Good morning. I was just thinking now that 2 years ago when I came forward with the topic for the Forum on Truth, I really didn't understand what I was getting into, that I would have to talk about truth all the time, not just think about it for 2 years, but also address every single big event, as Ayako was saying, and, offer discourse on truth. So it was really difficult task last night when I sat down to think about my welcoming remarks for today's symposium. What else can I say about truth? And I found myself recalling a proverb: every man is truthful until he speaks. So it suggests that the moment we attempt to articulate what we believe to be true, we risk failure or distortion. It is a somewhat sobering thought, especially for the person holding the microphone, and perhaps a slightly dangerous line with which to open an event devoted primarily to speaking on the very thought-provoking topic of truth and crisis. I may already be endangering the very object of our inquiry. So obviously I'm trying to make a joke, and you're not laughing. But as we know, every joke has a grain of truth. And yet this proverb contains a serious provocation. If truth were safest in silence, we would have little reason to convene. But we might also interpret it to mean that only through speaking can truth be put to the test. And so I think that our task today is precisely to undertake such a test, to see whether through articulation, debate, and public scrutiny, we can gain a clearer sense of what truth is, and to show that, though vulnerable in language, it is not extinguished by it. With that aspiration in mind, let me warmly welcome you and thank you for contributing your voices to this important conversation. I would also like, since this is probably the last time I'm getting to the microphone today, I also want to take this opportunity and thank the whole team of Wolf Humanities Center who made this 2 years of my life so much enjoyable. Thank you, guys.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, and thank you for that amazing keynote. It was a pleasure to hear about everyone's work so far, and I'm so sorry that I will have to leave early. I have another engagement at Penn. Sadly, I couldn't reschedule when I found out about this conference. But I think it's good that I'm going first in a way because I will directly be talking about universities. I don't think any of the other speakers will be doing that quite so directly. So this will be a little bit of a warm-up exercise for us. Like I'll get our synergies right to do knowledge production in the right way. My talk is titled Collective Distraction at the University. So just as a starter, I want you to consider a society with vast income and wealth inequality, where an overclass enjoys tremendous riches and an underclass lives in wretched conditions. You visit there and you look around, you pick up a newspaper, maybe you see a poster for a public talk, and you see that the question, should the government fund space tourism, is being featured on these documents. My intuition is that you would think there's something wrong in the society if such a question is being given priority in the public sphere. It turns out that epistemologically, characterizing what would be wrong with asking this question as such is difficult. In my work, I try to show that it's still doable. I want to hold those to account who are asking the wrong questions, but doing so takes a little bit of analytic work, some of which I will share with you today. Here's the intuition behind saying, no, there's nothing wrong with asking a question in particular. We use this refrain a lot. We'll say, I'm just asking. We say just asking because often when we say that we're just asking a question, we're submitting ourselves to the belief that asking questions, unless you're somehow claiming knowledge or truth of a fact, are innocent speech acts, epistemically speaking. Questions can be wrong for many other reasons. They can be morally wrong. They can be weaponized. They can involve other speech acts on the side. But as a question, qua question, we believe in the innocence of questions, especially given a history of million free speech project in modern liberal democracies. Asking questions is protected sphere. We believe that protecting asking of questions is part of what we need to do to protect free speech. So I call this the just asking myth. Just pause for a second. When you think about recent academic talks or events that you've been to, I want you to just think about whether there was a question that stood out to you where you'd really wanted to be able to criticize the person who raised this question, who directed their research energies in that particular direction. Does everybody have one? Okay, it doesn't take too long a time to consider one of these things. Okay, back to the just asking myth. Now that we all have our own theoretical targets, I have my own too. I'll tell you a little bit about it. So I started motivating this myth, which I call the just asking myth, which says that, okay, questions can be weaponized in speech, to cause moral harms, such as the question, what was she wearing when she was harassed? This question we immediately recognize as infelicitous in some manner, but that's not because of his epistemic properties. We don't like the question, what was she wearing when she was harassed? Because this question is weaponized against someone who has suffered harassment, questioning their personal choices, which we take to be irrelevant to the topic in hand. Another one, how much would single-payer healthcare cost? A question that in the American public considers every election cycle. We don't think there's anything wrong by asking this question. As an advocate of single-payer healthcare, I would like to know how much it would cost, and I think having sick people in society costs a lot more. So there's nothing wrong with the asking of question, but in a particular context in the public sphere, we know that this question is used to sow misinformation in society. Again, nothing wrong with the question, qua asking a question. Something wrong with what happens after. Either we harm people morally or we reveal misinformation that already exists in society. These are wrong things that questions do, but they don't do them qua questions. They do them because they are also, by asking a question, we don't simply carry out the speech act of asking, we also get to do other things because language is a complex mechanism. So this is the just asking myth, the idea that questions are innocent on their own. There's one caveat to this. If there's a philosopher of language in the room, it's not that I don't know about presuppositions, but I'm putting that aside. We can talk about it if you think it's relevant. I think we can shove that under the rug for now. So questions are requests for information that set success conditions and on explanation. This is what we understand them to be in philosophy of language. So asking what was she wearing when she was harassed as a question that comes with a success condition. The question is resolved when I know what she was wearing. Or how much would single-payer healthcare cost? The question, again, issues a request of information that is resolved when I know a number, the number that goes with the cost of the single-payer healthcare. So what does it take? These answers make up explanations. This is a simple story. Why do I want to undermine and complicate the story? Because this story relies on this belief that getting an answer is the same thing as getting an explanation. Let me take a step back. So when we think about answers, when I get an answer to the question, what was she wearing when she was harassed? And you say she was wearing a black dress that went down to her knees or something like this. You might think that the explanation that is being asked demanded by the inquirer into this question can be captured by a proposition as easy as naming the clothing item that this person was wearing. However, true explanations don't only give us answers, they also give us a perspective through which we can both see into the inquiry, why this question is being asked, and see the answer through the lens of the inquiry itself. So how much would single-payer healthcare cost if this question is part of an inquiry into how should the United States government dedicate resources to healthcare? The answer that you would get to this one particular question becomes part of an explanation that would motivate or demotivate people from advancing a particular policy proposal. So the question answer pair doesn't live in a petri dish outside of social reality. It exists in an explanatory framework whereby the question is a sub-question in an overarching inquiry. Therefore, the answer as a proposition that's given to satisfy the inquirer also exists in a framework of information. To be in touch with these bodies of information, we can't just add new beliefs to our belief system. What we also have to learn to do is to guide our attention in towards certainties and uncertainties in that space to get an understanding of the phenomenon at hand. If the phenomenon at hand is delivering healthcare to a population, then this question plays a completely different role than it would as part of another inquiry. So if we think that questions are not mere requests of information the way I might request coffee at a coffee shop, if we think of questions as being components of a larger project of inquiry, suddenly getting a true answer to be able to believe in it becomes only part of the story. The other part of the story is training our patterns of attention so that we understand. We come to a larger understanding of the phenomenon that we're actually inquiring into. So this is some of the framework by which we can begin to reject the just asking myth. The just asking myth stated that questions are pure requests of information, but after we understand a little bit more about how belief and attention work in tandem to give us an understanding of a phenomenon, we might want to say questions are actually requests for inquiring together. And if that's so, in asking a question, I'm also asking you to attend to particular relevant facts and ignore others. And you will do that with me to cooperate in an inquiry, in a rational inquiry that we might undertake together. But this already complicates the picture in such a way where the answer I'm looking for ceases to be just a proposition. It can be more properly understood as what I and some other philosophers would call a frame. So frames, as we think of them, are representational vehicles. They are most obviously captured by things like slogans, or they can be non-linguistic also. They can be diagrams or cartoons, but they are complicated representations that don't give you just one answer, but they give you a guidance through a phenomenon that trains your attention patterns in such a way that you not only think differently about what's true and false in that framework, but you also attend to those truths and falsities in a particular manner so that you can understand it. So the just asking myth is born out of the dismissal of attention as an epistemic faculty. And once we put attention back into the picture, we get a more realistic picture of what it means to come to knowledge, which says it's not only acquiring true propositions, but it's also learning how to attend to the right things. We see that inquiry begins with questions, and frames are how we usually end or pause our inquiries for a given moment by having attention guide our inquiry towards seeing both relevant facts and true facts. So relevance is a very important part of this picture. So an attendant view of language then takes language not to just communicate beliefs, but it also takes language to be shaping our attention. Whenever we use words, we don't only communicate information about what we think, but we also communicate how we should look at the world, what perspective we should embody. So language, as some people would like to say, is a tool of attunement. Questions attune us in particular ways also. So if questions are part of language and language attunes us to social reality, then questions can no longer be mere requests for information. They're also ways to look at reality in a particular way. And they can also be ideologically captured very easily. So let me tell you my story of the bad question. Having done this theoretical work, in 2020, I was teaching at the Harvard Kennedy School as a teaching assistant. This was during the first Trump administration, and I taught this course called, it wasn't called Truth and Politics, but it was that kind of course in the first wave of Hannah Arendt fandom. What the syllabus promised was that we would see how ignorance in this class would be manufactured in the public sphere. There was so much emphasis on ignorance. Why are people ignorant? What causes ignorance? And what philosophers were working on at the time was alternative facts, echo chambers, epistemic bubbles. New terms were being invented left and right. And then there was also a side project on conceptual engineering to justify the invention of new terms. This is what my field was consumed with. And I was coming into it and feeling very just jarred by the whole experience. Some of the questions that were initially posited on the syllabus were things like, you'll be asked to consider in this class what sort of policies are justified in keeping the public ignorant and which ones aren't. Or what is permissible for the government, and which secrets are permissible for the government to keep from us. This is the frame of technocratic liberalism. It is a frame according to which educated rulers sort through justifications of their exclusion of the people, the ignorant public, from governance. The course concluded, in fact, with a discussion of epistocracy. Is an epistocracy justifiable? Mind you, this is all in the context where graduates of Harvard Kennedy School expect themselves to find themselves jobs in the White House and become the governing elite, having learned what justifies them keeping secrets from the people. This is obviously a chilling frame by today's standards. We might be asking questions such as, is there a justified frame behind the altered photograph of a protester from Minnesota? These questions have become quite chilling in today's context. And having been a part of this course, I have been thinking back to, in particular, these questions as part of collective distraction. So I've given you some epistemic tools to say something about these questions. Let me apply them. Here's an epistemic objection that we can wield when we encounter a question like, is an epistocracy justifiable? We can say that the frame that this question gives rise to, the perspective that it asks us to embody, gives rise to collective distraction. Collective distraction is the condition of a society in which the public is distracted from attending to aspects of social reality that are matters of public relevance. This diagnosis operates only as a norm of public attention, because distraction in and of itself is not a problem. I can be distracted in public. I can watch as many TikTok videos as I want. I've never been on TikTok, so that's kind of a silly thing to say. But you can do that. I can YouTube weird videos. It also assumes shared public goals. So if we want to say that collective distraction is a social problem and what I would call a social pathology, though I don't have time to go into that, we need to assume shared public goals. Okay, collective distraction at the university. When we come to the university, the idea of having a shared goal becomes even more contested. In the past years, especially in response to the rising politicization of university spaces, these institutions have run to endorse different shapes of doctrines of neutrality. The doctrine of neutrality that universities have endorsed is just another clothing under which we find the just asking myth. Any set of beliefs can make up a belief system whose truth we might want to verify, the doctrine of neutrality says. So long as you put a coherent belief system up for discussion, you're in the clear. You're not distracting the academe or the public just by raising this question. But I want to suggest that this way of looking at the problem, just as problematic as the Just Asking myth was, stages the classroom as a place in a post-political fantasy, and university as a refuge of truth, because it assumes that the public goal is generation of knowledge, however irrelevant that knowledge might be. Hopefully, given that truth is in crisis, at least in this room, we can reject this bargain, and we can say that the public should strive towards something closer to reaching equality, social equality, or something like that. But once we say that and reframe public goals in this manner, we're also going to have to see universities as places where we engage in the verification of equality. And in order to engage in the verification of equality, the kinds of questions that we're going to have to ask as sub-questions of that larger inquiry will have to change. And some of what we do might be plausibly at that point called collective distraction. I'm probably out of time, but I want to say one little last remark to tell you that I too have taught at this point a truth and politics class here at Penn last semester. And I did start with Hannah Arendt, but instead of focusing on the difference between truth of opinion, I chose to focus on Hannah Arendt's thought on how we can build a common world. We had discussions around Rawls and Habermas on public reason, Leah Uppy and Jonathan White on partisanship. We read Simone Weil's Abolition of All Political Parties. We dissected individualism and the value and methods by which we can come to know and agree on the common good. I think in that class, we did the work to undermine the doctrine of neutrality and asked about methods by which we can be attuned to social problems and the role of political organizations to guide our attention. So by shifting from truth to attention, I think we were able to achieve something at least a little bit better than what my predecessors had done. But I'm happy to take any criticisms of that syllabus too. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very interesting talk about language philosophy and what I gloss as like the phatic uses of questions rather than question qua question. I guess my question is about kind of...
I know it gets really horrible. Questions and salience, which are two things I work on, it's impossible to not use those words when you're,
It seems that like there's often a sense of, oh, this is a bad actor question or a bad faith question. And how do you kind of conceptualize the moves that people make in delineating what those are within these epistemic bubbles, and also in the classroom as like trying to teach. Thank you.
All right, I think we've got to collect one more question before we go to answers. Anybody else have one? We've got one up in the front here.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ige. Now I feel like I have some terms to think with. I was just wondering what your own conceptual aikido around this kind of question would be in a kind of real-time encounter. There's one time years ago I saw a talk by Slavoj Žižek, and he actually responded to a question by saying, I don't agree with the premises of your question, and went on to hypothesize what the premises of the question were. And so I wanted to think about how do we respond to questions and question them in real time.
Thank you so much. So bad actors and bad faith questions. The model that I have been using to think about bad questions is one in which the speaker and speaker intentions are quite out of the picture. And the reason for that is I'm interested in questions in the public sphere where once a question is posed, it takes a life of its own and is transmitted, especially in the age of social media, quite far. So it becomes abstracted from the speaker itself. And our abilities to infer speaker intentions, which is such an important feature of dialoguing, of course, gets lost. So one caveat that I make in some of my writing on this is that I'm thinking about public discourse and these questions that are abstracted away or can be abstracted away from the speakers. So that changes the tools we use to interpret particular questions. Bad faith questions, though, I think the kinds of questions that I'm interested in, which I also call ideological questions, if they shape inquiry in ways that play into the hands of the powerful, I call them ideological questions. These questions are bad faith because they don't engage in genuine inquiry. So insofar as bad faith questioning is concerned, I don't think we need to find that, again, in the intentions of the speaker, but we can find that in the language use, sort of abstracted away from speakers themselves. About what I would call counter speech. Counter speech is an exciting, I think, thing to think about. I have seen what you mentioned, which is just to explicitly engage in counter speech. I don't agree with the premises of your question. One caveat to that is that there are two ways to make that objection. One of them is to call out a presupposition that the question has, but I think that calls out a misinformation that the question might already have baked in it. But there's another way to say I don't agree with the premises of your question and try to engage in a conversation about what's relevant to the inquiry. And I don't know which one Zizek did in that instance. These are both good ways to go about when we encounter bad questions, to counter them. The other way is to ask another question. The great thing about linguistic interaction, especially doing this sort of battle of questions, is that just as people have recourse to the just asking myth, you have recourse to the just asking myth tools too. So there's a great example of this that I had heard in discussion with another philosopher. So she was saying that she gets asked as a Marxist philosopher all the time, why has socialism failed everywhere it's been tried? And she just asks back, why has capitalism failed everywhere it's been tried? And that's another way to just play with questions. If you think this request is relevant to the inquiry, here's the one that I think is relevant, which is going to, we're going to have to talk about what's relevant next. Like, there's no other move but to go meta, because the two questions are on a par. Another example of this would be from how much would single payer healthcare cost? If I just ask how much does having sick people in a society cost, then again, we're going to have to ask which information is relevant and how can we structure inquiry. The way to treat inquiry problems is to get intentional about inquiries and to name our desiderata more explicitly, and to have answers to our methods of knowing without having an answer to why is it relevant that I'm asking that question. You don't get recourse on the rational on some rational board of appeals if you cannot stand behind the relevance of your claims.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Riefenstahl's words come from an interview with the French film critic Michel Delayet in the September 1965 Cahiers du Cinéma, at the time the most prestigious film publication in the world, which single-handedly launched auteur theory through the editorial leadership of André Bazin and the epoch-making Nouvelle Vague film movement. Delaye was a known supporter of both the new wave filmmaking of Jean-Luc Godard and the cinema verite style of documentary, emerging coterminously in Paris around 1960. Although Delaye would later be decried for his modern eclecticism, theoretical inconsistency, and senile hippieism in the French ultra-left journal Cinétique. So a lot of controversies around him. In the interview with Delaye, Riefenstahl insists childishly, petulantly, with complete unrepentance on the film's status as art and as a document of historical truth. The film is purely historical, I specify. It is a film verite. It reflects the notion of that which was then, in 1934, history. It's therefore a document, not a propaganda film. Oh, I know what propaganda is. It means recreating certain events to illustrate a thesis, or in the face of certain events, of dropping one thing to highlight another. I found myself at the heart of an event which was the reality of a certain time and a certain place. My film is made up of what arose from it. In this quote, Riefenstahl explicitly courts comparisons to Delaye and Caillet's beloved cinema verite movement by using the phrase film verite, arguing for the film as the truth of history, vérité en histoire, in 1934. Paradoxically, Riefenstahl both insists on its artful stature while also denying any illustration, recreation, these are quotes from her, or emphasis of certain events over others, despite the fact that events were staged in Triumph of the Will explicitly to be represented in such a grandiose nature on screen. The film is characterized by pans which slowly reveal the overwhelming size of crowds, explicitly guiding the viewer to an experience of awe. The most common framing device is a low-angle hero shot, whether of speechifying Nazis or teenage Aryan boys beaming into the sun. What Riefenstahl might not have known, persistently claiming to have actually seen very few films in the interview, and what Delaye likely knew very well, is that the term cinema verite derived from a Jewish Bolshevik, Soviet filmmaker Dziga Vertov, born Boris Kaufman, progenitor of films that we would now call avant-garde documentaries. The origin of the term is Dziga Vertov's 1922 to 1925 Chronika, or newsreel series Kino Pravda, which means literally cinema truth. French sociologist Edgar Morin penned this term, inspired by Vertov, in an article published in 1959. This is Cinema Verite. And he then collaborated with ethnographic filmmaker Jean Rouch, whose works he praised. Rouch's films are a complex melange of documentary footage, subject collaboration, and fictional conceit. The word ethnofiction is most commonly associated with his films today. Rouch and Morin's collaborative film experiment became Chronique d'un été, or Chronicle of a Summer, from 1961, and was an international sensation, the first cinema verite film. By 1963, however, cinema verite had merged with a North American-born movement called direct cinema, despite profound aesthetic, ethical, and political differences between the two movements. Yet new technologies of the era were crucial for both movements, the Coutant Malto-Eclair camera and the Nagra magnetophone recorder. These were declared the caméra vivante, or living camera, after a television program by Richard Leacock and Robert Drew, running from 1961 to 1962. Through these technologies, large and energy-consuming vacuum tubes were replaced by transistors, and the weight of sound recorders was reduced from about 200 pounds to 20. So huge difference, and you can kind of see this in the way that in Chronicle of a Summer, the kind of people who are asking questions to people on the street in the first 20 minutes of the film, the only thing other people have to do to answer their questions are, to take the mic into their hands, and then the recording device is in the briefcase. So they were able to kind of hide the tools relatively easily. Not as easily as today, obviously, but much easier than it was just a few years before then. In this talk, which derives from the introduction to my in-progress book, Cinema Truth and Its Discontents, Prehistories, and Afterlives, I provide a summary of my book's findings. My book shows that the path of film truth is less linear than circuitous and meandering, swayed by human errors and productive misapprehensions. The more ubiquitous the term cinema truth became, the more it became simplistic marketing, devoid of its original, profoundly philosophical ambiguity. Undoubtedly, however, the appeal of a documentary truthfulness still holds deep rhetorical power in contemporary liberal society. However, in an age of blatant untruths, this immersion into cinema truth's strange and surreal prehistories and its afterlives aided by new original language research and nearly lost archives, make it increasingly relevant as an object of study. The book unearths the vexed genealogy of cinema verite to show that its only constancy was inconstancy, that documentary realism was, throughout its many evolutions, always already critiqued as both convention and artifice, even as its practitioners aspired to more emancipatory forms. The filmmaker Dziga Vertov, allegedly the originator of this study, provides a complicated and ambiguous, albeit prophetic origin. Today, he is most well known for the exuberantly experimental and intertitle-free Man with a Movie Camera, or Человек с киноаппаратом from 1929, now firmly ensconced in the film historical canon. Although during his lifetime he was best known for 3 songs about Lenin, or Три песни о Ленине from 1934, which McKay describes as an uneasy marriage between the avant-garde and socialist realism. And he had to publicly apologize for the formalism, quote-unquote, of his earlier avant-garde films. Vertov's sensuous and affective avant-garde documentary filmmaking trajectory is defined by a fervent interest in the quotidian, yet it is equally defined by highly experimental montage and editing. I feel like I should have like a trigger warning just for formal experiment, which in my classes, I very rarely give trigger warnings except for formal trigger warnings just because of the strobe effects. In Vertov's films, a filmmaker sets up his tripod within a mug of beer, as in Man with a Movie Camera, a bust of Lenin appears in a rushing dam, as in The 11th Year, bread slices itself and multiplies, as in Stride Soviet, a slaughtered bull comes back to life and rejoins its herd in a pasture, as in Kino Eye. Such experiments, which appear distanced from strictly Marxist dialectical materialism, create sensory perceptual shocks and intensities of emotion. In the introduction to my previously published book, Anti-Fascism and the Avant-Garde, I connect Vertov's filmmaking to the concept of kino-ощущение, or cinematic sensation, a Soviet-specific term highlighting a revolutionary mode of affect, and draw on this term in my analysis of avant-garde documentaries in the French and Japanese 1960s. Thank you. In this 2025 book, Vertov is an inspiration and a quiet, ghostly co-conspirator for these revolutionary 1960s productions, but my current project engages with his theories and legacy more directly. Vertov died in relative obscurity in 1954, a mere year after Stalin, and half a decade before Edgar Morin and Jean Rouch, as well as communist film critic, Sovietophile, and historian Georges Sadoul, would invoke his name during the marketing for Chronicle of a Summer. Although the thread from Chronicle of a Summer to Man with a Movie Camera was already quite tenuous, the popularity of Chronicle of a Summer led to many copycat productions that claimed participation in the same genre. By the mid-1960s, like a botched game of telephone, the films partaking in cinema verite looked very different indeed from the trick-filled wonders of the Soviet avant-garde. Yet it is precisely this mid-1960s era of Delahaye's interview with Riefenstahl that France saw a great swell of interest in early Soviet filmmaking, especially Dziga Vertov. This great interest in the avant-gardist period is largely indebted to Sadoul, who with his Polish-born wife Ruta traveled to the USSR in the early 1960s and retrieved many documents by and about Vertov from fellow filmmaker, collaborator, and Vertov's widow, Elizaveta Svilova. Through Sadoul and Svilova's painstaking efforts, some of Vertov's texts were finally and slowly made available in French outlets by the mid-1960s. In addition, the French translation of Nikolai Pavlovich Avramov's 1962 biography of Vertov was published in 1965, the same year as the Delahaye interview. Before Sadoul's work, however, Vertov was rarely discussed. He was first mentioned at length in Cahiers through a November 1961 interview with Sergei Yutkevich, a filmmaker more well-known in France at the time and a member of Vertov's 1920s avant-garde generation, alongside other luminaries such as Vsevolod Padovkin and the aforementioned Sergei Eisenstein. Chronicle of a Summer had been released that year, and any discussion of cinema verite was au courant, thus priming the French public for an interest in the enigmatic and strangely named Soviet figure at the root of this popular term. Cahiers would only publish significant work on Vertov starting in the June 1963 issue, when Sadoul penned several articles alongside Vertov's text, Kinok's Revolution, originally published in Left, or Left Front of the Arts, an avant-garde journal, edited by revolutionary poet Vladimir Mayakovsky and formalist writer Osip Brik in 1923. The same issue included an interview with Jean Rouch, who had already been compared to Vertov since Morin's article, that I mentioned before. In the 1961 interview with Yudkevich, Kaye's subheading declared Dziga Vertov even a precursor of Rush. By the time of Riefenstahl's interview, however, cinema verite had come to overlap significantly with the North American documentary genre of direct cinema, pioneered by Albert and David Maysles, Robert Drew, D.A. Pennebaker, and Richard Leacock. In fact, this confusion between cinema verite and direct cinema continues today, as witnessed by the current Criterion Channel lineup of alleged cinema verite films. These filmmakers showed little interest in Vertov, having usually not seen any of his films until the late 1960s. Their films, prioritizing fly-on-the-wall footage and a total rejection of the director as authorial voice, appeared entirely at odds with Vertov's manically trick-filmed editing. As Kaye critic Louis Marcarel wrote in 1963, the Leacock method excludes the intervention of the filmmaker in the life of the observed subject. Yet when the general public, still largely unfamiliar with Vertov's work, heard the term verite, it was far less Vertov and more Maysles, Drew, Pennebaker, and Leacock, and perhaps to a lesser extent Jean Rouch, who had begun working with fictionality and surrealism more explicitly in the mid-60s, that immediately sprang to mind. Given the popularity of direct cinema, Riefenstahl's proclamation that her film is only a film verite document thus shows the former Nazi hiding childlike in the coattails of the celebrated new nonfiction genre. The term provided safety, a guise of alleged objectivity, and even journalistic prestige. Yet Leni Riefenstahl's use of the term traces us back to the Jewish Bolshevik filmmaker her Nazi ideology aimed to eradicate. In my book, I argue that filmmaking such as Vertov's is not only wholly different from an alleged film verite document, but works explicitly to emancipate the viewer, to estrange and even re-enchant in the vein of surrealism. My book shows that the path of film truth is paved by productive misreadings, for instance by Georges Sadoul, who grafted larger philosophical meanings onto the term kino pravda before his extensive research visits to the USSR in the late 50s and early 60s. In fact, The Truth of Pravda was also the title of the ubiquitous Soviet newspaper, making Vertov's series a kind of Cine Washington Post or Cine New York Times with a proper socialist twist. The truth of Vertov's Kino Pravda is neither scientific nor objective. It is a truth far more poetic and uncanny. Although Jean Rouch and Edgar Morin's film is quite formally distinct from Vertov's, even their production held some of Vertov's experimental approach and leftist convictions. The American filmmakers, however, were perceived as being too unaesthetic, their truth too technologically determined. Their films, according to Cahiers critic and filmmaker Jean-Claude Bringuier, plunged into the tumult of reality to the point of suffocation. In 1964, filmmaker and critic Luc Mollet would write that, not yet, go back. There is, so this is a quote from Luc Mollet, there is a permanent coexistence of truths. Life shown by an invisible camera ends up appearing more suspicious than convincing. His reaction against direct cinema criticizes its enmeshment into the status quo, into the comfort with which viewers accept what it presents as objective truth. While the truth is only an exceptional, abnormal thing, which, like quality, can and must only exist once in 100, these polluting and positive elements are the norm, and we cohabit with them very comfortably and quasi-permanently. And today's Frenchman only admits the truth, and only the objective truth, as stable, immediate, similar precisely to that of these competitions which infect our TV, where everything is resolved by categorical yes or no, or combinations of numbers, or very specific answers. This is the most French thing I've ever read, by the way. Mollet then attacks direct cinema from the left, criticizing a status quo of passive viewership that believes everything it sees. The mention of television here is important, as Drew, Leacock, and Maysles were almost exclusively associated with TV broadcasts and journalism. Mollet criticizes Drew and Leacock for their tendency to present truth with a capital T, which viewers then understood to be objective truth, stable and immediate, something to which they have immediate access. The comfort with which viewers cohabit with these elements is disturbing. French critics were frustrated by the American documentarists' stubborn insistence on access to truth and reality. They also increasingly found direct cinema to be repetitive and even nauseating. This is a term that they've used, featuring, as one otherwise positive review notes, quote, almost an insane profusion of street decorations, an incalculable abundance of red lights, telephone booths, endlessly going up and down staircases, and finally a tedious excess, I was going to write nauseating, close-ups of shoes, feet, etc. End quote. This, the critics tend to agree, is an aesthetic choice in itself rather than an alignment with a more authentic reality. Given this history, it is perhaps less surprising that Riefenstahl aligned with verite, or rather more precisely direct cinema, as a source of some elusive, objective, stable, immediate truth with a capital T. For this alignment, hopelessly naive, refuses to acknowledge ideology, the hand of the editor, and the fundamental of subjectivity inherent to the documentary medium, and, in fact, all art. Yet this confusion is a legacy that continues to our day, preventing not just acknowledgement of bias, quotation marks, but a cultural misunderstanding of the role of nonfiction media. What resulted from this misunderstanding is a catastrophic lack of media literacy that continues to disturb and confound, especially in the age of AI, where images and text can no longer be analyzed as authentic through the tools at our disposal. I contend that the answer is not to dig even deeper into an almost metaphysical and impossible objectivity, but to recover the surrealist and playful roots of the documentary form, to see the art of nonfiction as fundamentally expansive, capacious, life-affirming, and even speculative in nature. My perhaps polemical argument is that documentary must shed its positivistic cloak. I feel like there are a lot of resonances with the keynote earlier today. To follow the argument of the late scholar and filmmaker Jill Godmellow, perhaps we must, please work. Oh my God. Work. Such dramatic effects have failed me. All right, please, thank you. Thank you. Perhaps we must kill the documentary, and this is the title of her famous 2022 book, so the documentary might live. I term this new post-documentary genre the après-doc, a multifarious mode blending truth and fiction in the vein of Vertov, less concerned about the convention of realism than the unveiling of larger truths only possible through surrealist and playfully provocative aesthetic devices. And in fact, these après documentaries already exist. In the path-breaking experimental hybrid work of Radu Juda, Jody Mack, Jajan Ke, Sergei Laznitsa, Kiro Rosso, John Akamfra, Jen Kiru, Mati Diop, Sky Hopinka, and others. Revitalizing these ideas allow us to generate surprisingly strange experiments that can transform what we believe to be possible in the world of nonfiction, and indeed in our own catastrophic and monstrous geopolitical realities. Thank you.
I thought it might be fun for you to talk a little bit about, given the overlap that you were obviously already excited about earlier, the pan as the technique used in Triumph of the Will versus the pan as surveillance that was talked about in the keynote earlier today. So I thought you might have some fun opinions on that. So if you wanted to talk about panning, I'd be very excited to hear about that. More questions from the room? Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'll throw in a question. And I'm still trying to process the keynote together with the three papers. I don't think I'll succeed in doing so quickly. But I have a question perhaps directed towards Emily. So I was reading a fairly recent New Yorker article on brainwashing, and the controversy about, is that a term we want to continue to use? How useful is it, etc. And a point was made within the article that brainwashing is a term we use for people on the other side. We engage in rational education and persuasion. They engage in brainwashing. And in light of polarization in society and what you said about sort of the larger landscape in which charismatic religion is making a return, is your sort of attention to the micro techniques and so on a possible way to go beyond that binary? Am I correct in sort of seeing that as part of your project?
Hello, yes, thank you for fascinating presentations. My question is also directed to Emily, but perhaps it could go to either. I noted something that you had said about how in the practices you were observing, it was important, or so the charismatic leader was saying, important to attend to the inner, but then quickly kind of pulled that rug out and started questioning what is the inner. And I wanted to ask about what functionally this may be doing, or at least in your observations, when it comes to certitude, but uncertainty, destabilization, is in the same, I suppose, with filmmaking techniques as well, and this questioning of what is assumed to be stable ground. Is this leading to a relearning of the self and self-reliance, or is this more opening spaces for leaders to step in and say, don't trust you, but trust me and your destabilized state, me, charismatic, or the form that seems to be quite attractive and quite convincing of the world that it builds? Trust this in your sense of destabilized or instability. Thank you.
All right, that's a set of 3 questions. Who would like to start?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. I think I'm going to piggyback off of what Althea said in the response to that question, to the question I asked about the plan after the keynote, which I really resonate with, which is that I don't really believe that any particular technique has in itself a always existing political or ideological register, but how it's used. I don't necessarily agree with Jean-Luc Godard that said that the long take is the most ethical, or was it, I think, also Bazin that said that? I don't really agree with that. I think for me, where the politics come in is like the degree of visibility of the aesthetic techniques, and what I find really horrifying about the way that the pan is used in a kind of surveillance mechanism is how it hides the fact that there is someone, that is doing the panning, and where that comes from and where the power lies, even if it's kind of someone moves and it's like a ring camera or whatnot. I kind of consider the work that I'm doing right now in this book feeding off of my last book. I kind of think of the 2 books as a collected project. And then the first book, I thought through the way that that experimental documentary can inculcate like a radical media literacy, in which the tools that documentary uses, cinematography, editing, etc., can actually guide the viewer to criticize the truth-making power of the image itself. I think there is a way to use a pan in a way that unveils the fact that there is someone that is doing that work. And that's where I feel the kind of radical filmmaking of Dziga Vertov and Leni Riefenstahl is at an extreme difference, right? Because she kind of insists that it's not art, it's artful but not artful, right? It's like art, but it's actually a document. You kind of can't have it both ways, girl. No, but there's a lot of hiding that is happening, right, in these aesthetic techniques. And what I'm interested in, and I think what Althea was also describing, is the way that estrangement and destabilization is kind of used as a politics. So I think any technique can be both used to hide and to unveil. I kind of see it as a larger commentary kind of on this idea of like a radical media literacy.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the questions. And that's actually I think that I'm very similar in this thinking of form being not necessarily tied to a specific political implication, but this is a very difficult terrain to navigate, at least within my own limits. Especially when thinking about the way that, there have been plenty of critiques of secular liberalism across different fields, including my own anthropology. And how does one move beyond secular liberalism? And there are many ways people have done it, but there's many dimensions of this. So my previous work was on spirit mediumship, and there was a question of what it means to rethink a fundamental justice through a complicated reworking of the symbols of Maoism to unthink the inequalities, drastic inequalities that have affected China today since Mao. And those mediums partook in particular kinds of practices toward the unseen world, toward worlds that are not scientifically verified, in order to make a particular argument about the historical present and its problems. Meanwhile, on this side of this project, there are charismatic Christians who are engaging in not quite similar, but very parallel, analogous practices of retraining the senses to perceive what's truly at risk in the world and which direction to go. And so to Ayaka's question, I definitely think that this problem of brainwashing and the other side being within the context of polarization, it seems like impossible to think the other side without particular kind of flattening. And I think that that limits a lot of thinking across, various spheres. And I don't know if I'm moving beyond this is the tricky part. What does it mean to move beyond the binary? I do think the minute practices are important. And I think I'm also needing to contend with my own previous analytic and quasi-political use of what it means to engage with these practices and what it means that these practices can be taken up for essentially the opposite politics on paper, politics in the kind of left-right sense of politics, not in the much more deeper, complicated sense. So then to Caitlin's question, the pulling the rug out, I think this is very crucial because I think that these are not the brash, ignorant public practices that are often presumed to be underlying mass, religious or spiritual movements. I think that there's an assumption that there lacks a skeptical practice, that there lacks a careful practice, and that there's kind of just these sweeping political assumptions, the brainwashing, right? The other side is brainwashed. So I think in attending to these specific logical and sensory practices of pulling the rug out, it's to also rethink how very different pockets, culturally, politically, et cetera, are re-engaging with problems of objectivity, rationality, and skepticism, which are kind of hallmarks of modern knowledge. And hallmarks of modern knowledge are being taken up in such different ways. So pulling the rug out is so important because these are highly educated folks who have gone through university training, like most of us here, and in order to believe or undo a truth takes a lot. And so then what are the implications of doing that rug pulling? It's a question mark, but I do think the rug pulling has something to do with the question raised by anthropologists like Saba Mahmood and those like Amy Hollywood of, is critique secular? Is pulling the rug out secular? It's not. So what does it mean then to rethink these problems once again? So yeah, sorry, those are
Thank you so much. We have time for a couple more questions. All right, let's do another set of 3. We've got one from up there, right there.
Thank you for these wonderful.
Let's get the mic so that the Zoom, the mysterious ghostly surveillance can.
Thank you for these wonderful talks. I had a question for Julia. I was wondering I loved the detailed mapping and capturing of Vertov's, being seen in Paris and France and his reception. And so I was fascinated. And my question is, could you elaborate more on what is substantively different in après documentary versus the kind of critical practice in almost like counter projects against kind of dominant visual regimes that are already happening in the silent era. So I would love to hear more about what marks these differences.
We've got one in the back over there.
Thank you all both so much. Both talks were really fascinating. So something that, and this goes to both of you actually, something that Julia said at the end was same technique can hide or unveil. And I thought that was very, very interesting because it gets to the question about like self-definition, right? So with a lot of the directors that you're speaking about, right, there would be maybe an early connection with this idea of cinema verite, but then afterwards it becomes just a box for critics to put one in. And I'm interested just essentially where you essentially feel that self-definition does come into play with this. And this goes with Emily as well. I'm so happy that you brought in Dowson and Gallison. I thought that was really, really amazing. And I was just wondering if you could speak again about maybe this self-definition of what could be an analog for this mechanical turn, the photographic turn, albeit without the machine, right? So this self-definition of objectivity through this kind of like interweaving of one's like background, but also like pulling it into something broader that can be felt by more people. Thank you.
All right, one more question
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to go back to the idea of that just asking myth and thinking about when, Julia, when you were talking about Riefenstahl saying, well, I just had a camera and I was just, pointing it at stuff. But that also made me think of someone like Frederick Wiseman, who also says, I just have a camera and I'm just pointing it at stuff, but is using it to build this, huge body of work that's investigating and critiquing institutions. And that seems the difference between those, one being a point of propaganda and the other being, I'm giving myself a position to make a critique. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
All right, that's 3 questions. Where do we want to begin?
Sure. I think can I just clarify what is the self-definition that comes with that kind of practice? Is that yeah, I think that the self-definition partly is precisely like the ultra-critical contemporary person. It seems kind of silly to say, but like, it's what it means to go beyond what you think you see as critique, what is laid out as critique in a public sphere, in that particular case of urban China, including the digital as well as the everyday other common public spheres. And what is it? The without machine part, I think it's not a technophobic church. They all use various technologies, just as everyone else. I think that it's more of a sense that one needs to peel away the layers of what has been inculcated within by particular education systems, and then how to unlearn and relearn thinking. And so I think that I think that that's part of the self-definition. And I think that this is, again, going on other sides as well, movements to decolonize the psyche, and these, in very different sites, are also doing this, is putting technology into question and re-engaging body, mind, to do something different. So I think, I think there's the self-definition is a question beyond, I am a Christian, etc. Beyond the self-definition religiously, I think there's a question of being able to see through the layers of untruth that are present.
Yeah, thank you all for those great questions. In terms of, just to continue off of what Emily was saying about self-definition, I think what's really interesting, or I think what would be very interesting for more filmmakers to do, is actually claim the term documentary for their films that wouldn't otherwise be understood as documentary. When I teach documentary, the kind of inevitable conclusion that I kind of gently guide my students into realizing is that anything could be a documentary if you just call it a documentary. That really the only thing that is consistent amongst documentaries is that someone claimed that something is non-fictional, even though non-fictional and documentary are not the same thing. But Grierson's idea of a documentary being a creative interpretation of actuality is actually almost all films, to be honest. And so what even is documentary? It's just someone saying it's so, right? So what if, there are a lot of films that actually are nominated for Oscars, over the last couple of years that I think could be classified as documentary. Actually, I think Nomadland is almost a pure documentary as such. So I think the self-definition is important. Actually, I think the more filmmakers that kind of claim documentary that otherwise would not have claimed such a thing, I think that could only serve to kind of rupture the idea of this, I was fascinated by this. I need to ask you more about that, the text about objectivity, because I think that really is just such a clear connecting thread between our work. Yeah, Althea's question on what is substantively different from the après-doc and the visual regimes of silent cinema. I think what is interesting to me about these, and I kind of give it this name just to distinguish it from an earlier kind of avant-garde documentary tradition. But I think there's a lot that Vertov was doing that I think many of the filmmakers that I am thinking about now in the contemporary moment already described as Vertovian, and I think that is quite fascinating. A lot of them even reference him explicitly. I have a whole other talk that I did on like how some of these people are invoking his work. Kira Russo's Un Gran Movimiento, a film from 3 years ago, you not only uses scenes with a lot of really intense, high-octane, quick editing the way that Vertov does. The film is a quasi-fiction, quasi-documentary set in a mine in an indigenous community in Bolivia, and you watch a character slowly die of poisoning by environmental poisoning. And in the scene of his death, there's this like 15-20 minute sequence of really, really, really intense quick cuts. And the soundtrack from the most famous soundtrack associated with Man with a Movie Camera is used. And that's the Alloy Orchestra soundtrack, which is actually, it sounds super contemporary, but is actually based on Vertov's original notes for what he wanted the music to sound like. So they're already invoking, these silent films. And I don't think Vertov was the only one doing this, but I kind of hone in on him because he's just so frequently discussed, throughout film history, especially in the 60s. And I think what these films are doing, as opposed to actually, to continue off of the next question about, to continue to Fred Wiseman, I think what these après-docs are doing, as opposed to Fred Wiseman's films, are, explicitly what I was talking about before, like destabilizing the image and actually making the hand of the artist and author very open, very obvious, and that kind of allows the viewer to kind of look at the imagery and to see this process as something that is created, that actually documentary is something that is a collaboration between a lot of different types of people, and that there's not only one particular interpretation of an image. I do think that, Vertov did make propaganda films. He was a propaganda filmmaker. I think all films are ideological in some way, including obviously Fred Wiseman's. And, there are ways in which Vertov's films align with the kind of Stalinist mode a little bit later in his career. I do think that's true. So there, I think, one can argue that there's a lot that après-doc brings to the table that Vertov does not, But yeah, so I think there's a lot that silent cinema already has, and a lot of my project is actually like looking back and seeing what has been missing in the archives. Like, this is not how his films were interpreted, and not how he would have interpreted his own films. So how to actually see these early experiments as non-continuous with the way that we're thinking about documentary imagery today. I think Fred Wiseman, rest in peace. I think his 1960s films are really fascinating. High School has this like really enchanting quality about it, because it does feel like, it really convinces the viewer that there's an inobtrusive hand. And I think that is a problem. I think it's a real problem when his films aren't explicit about how there is an editing role. I also think there's, for a lot of these films, a question of access, and his films are, have become, he passed away recently, but 5-6 hour films, it's yeah, I know we have to move on, but I think I don't want to throw poor Fred Wiseman under the bus, but I do think that there's a place for destabilizing the documentary form that his films, especially later in his career, are not really were not really doing. But yeah, thanks for the questions.